Salvete, discípuli, soy el tutorísimo, tu profesor favorito, evidentemente, y en el día de hoy os traigo el vídeo del primer tema de este curso, que es el siguiente. The first unit, the Ancien Regime and the Enlightenment, o sea, el antiguo régimen y la ilustración. Vamos a explicarlo y para ello ya sabéis, nos valemos de esto y nos valemos de la presentación que os voy a mostrar a continuación, que hemos tratado en clase y que tenéis disponible, tanto apuntes como presentación, en el aula virtual. Así que, vamos allá. Magia. So, this is the first unit of the course, the Ancien Regime, remember it's a French word, and the Enlightenment. And this is what we are going to study. First, what is the Ancien Regime and all of its characteristics. Second, the criticism to the Ancien Regime, mainly the Enlightenment. And finally, some of the Spanish history of the 18th century. Let's start with the Ancien Regime. And, Dios mío, first we need to know what is or what was the Ancien Regime. It was the main economic, social and political system of the early modern age, and also, of course, of the 18th century. It has started in the late Middle Ages, but it's going to last until, in most of the territory of Europe until the 18th century, the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century in some parts, such as in Russia, until the beginning of the early 20th century. So, as a summary, it's going to feature an agricultural economy, an economy based on mostly agriculture. Socially, the society is going to be divided in estates, in 3 estates, the nobility, the clergy, and the third state, or the commoners. And finally, in the political feature, we are going to see that the political system is an absolute monarchy, in which the king holds all the power, has an absolute power by divine right. And this is how Europe looked like in the beginning of the 18th century, after the War of the Spanish Succession. So let's see each one of these characteristics, economy, society, and policy, a bit deeper. So first, economy. We have said that the economy was mainly based on agriculture, was mainly rural. Most of the population, up to the 80%, worked on agriculture. And they worked these lands which owner or whose owner was was usually a lord who belonged to one of the privileged states, a noble or someone from the clergy. This land was entailed, in español, amortizadas, which means that it could not be bought or sold. Remember that there is a mistake in the notes. This means that the land could not be bought or sold, and it was most of this land was property of the privileged states. This in this agriculture they use, as you have seen, or you for example here they use in sites is guadaña, sickles, and here they're using these traditional methods and with few technological innovations. This means the productivity of agriculture was very low, as it had been throughout all of history. So most people practice subsistence farming, and this means that they produce enough food to barely survive. So there was very few trade, very few surplus, excedentes. These peasants had to pay manorial rents and taxes. This means that this peasant who is working the land for the owner is the noble who lives in this castle, this peasant has to pay rents, in this case manorial rents if it's a noble, or the tithe if it's to a clergyman. which is something that is featured in the Bible in this episode of Abraham and Melchizedek. And this is how they paid taxes. They usually pay them not in money, but with the very own products of the agriculture, such as eggs or this chicken or whatever. Society during the Ancien regime was divided in 3 estates, estamentos. You belong to a state because of your birth. If you are the son of a noble, you are noble. If you are the son of a clergyman, this means that the priest is very naughty. Now, usually the second sons of the noblemen became priests. And finally, the ordinary people. And this comes from the Middle Ages, in which the population was divided in these 3 parts, each one with a function. The clergy's purpose was to pray for the rest of the people. The nobility purpose was to fight and protect the rest of the people. And the vast majority of the people, who were commoners, their purpose on life was to work for the privileged. And the first 2 states, the clergy and the nobles, they were privileged. They had their own laws, but the most important privilege is that they didn't have to pay taxes. And that's a thing that the third state had to do. Even though the third state was composed by most of the people, as more than 95% of the population. So they were the vast majority of the people and the poorest, but they were the only ones who had the obligation to pay taxes. You can see here that the clergy was 1% of the population, the nobles 2% of the population or the people, and the rest of the people, 97%, was part of the third estate. And what does this mean? That this means that the third estates, as you can see in this cartoon from the French Revolution, that the 3 estates had to support the clergymen and the nobles. And this will lead to some violence, you know. Finally, the political system. How was the monarchy during the Ancien regime? Well, it was characterized by the absolute monarchy. Here you can see a lot of characteristics of this absolute monarchy: royal army, centralized bureaucracy, la grandeur, the control of the religious authorities, and final blah 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 blah. What is the most important thing? That the king, this is Louis XIV, the king held all the power, or almost all the power. It was hereditary, which means that after his death his son is going to reign in his place. And the most important thing, its legitimacy came from God. It was a monarchy because of the divine right, por derecho divino. So he exercised power in God's name. What could the king do? They could do whatever he wanted, almost whatever he wanted. He could issue laws, appointed judges, administer justice, commanded the army, blah blah blah. You have a lot of functions in your notes. You need to know at least 1 or 2 examples. Here you can see the map of Europe in the year 1700, and as you can see there are a lot of monarchies, but some of them were not monarchies, or they were not absolute monarchies. The 2 most important exceptions were the Dutch Republic and the English Kingdom. And this is the most famous absolute monarch was Louis XIV of France, but we have some examples for like in Spain with Felipe V. I said that the kings could do almost whatever they wanted because their power was limited in some specific cases, such as introducing new taxes, in which they had the obligation, or there was mandatory for them, to convene or to summon their national assemblies. Well, we can call them national, or the Estates Assembly, that's a better name. And they had different names depending on the country. This is in France, they were called the États Généraux, the Estates General, los Estados Generales, or In Spain they were called Cortes, in England the Parliament, etc. etc. There were two exceptions to this, in which two countries we have already named them, the Dutch Republic and later the Dutch monarchy, and the Kingdom of England or Great Britain, in which the Parliament had a lot of, well, not a lot of power, but they have an important power and they could rule alongside the king. Here you can see the States General of the Dutch Republic and the British House of Commons. These are the two exceptions, Great Britain and the Low Countries. And this is the situation in the early modern age, but there are going to be some changes in the 18th century, which can be considered as a transition to the 19th century and the contemporary age. First, the population growth or the demographic growth. The population rose a lot during the 18th century, almost double from 100 million, to 200 million. And this was because of improvements in agriculture and in medicine and in hygiene. Why for example, why did this happen? Because some of these agricultural improvements is the new rotation system, also known as Norfolk system. By this system, it replaced the previous 3-year crop rotation, and I will say it. So the land is 100% of the land is producing every year instead of the 66% of the land, the 2/3. And also in medical advances we can name the discovery of the vaccines by Edward Jenner at the end of the 18th century. Also, they're going to appear this new artisanal production system. If you remember from the previous course in tercero de la ESO, the artisanal production was controlled by the guilds, los gremios. They had the monopoly in the cities of the jobs of the artisanal craft work, but in this 18th century there are going to be these new production systems that are going to try to escape the control of the guilds. They are first the domestic system, which consists in that a peasant or these peasants in winter where they are free because it's winter, they were provided by a trader, usually a merchant, with the necessary raw materials and tools, like this, to make these products. And these products could be sold at the price that the merchant wanted, instead of the price that the guild had previously set. The other one is the factories, o las manufacturas. And they were factories run usually by the state, by the monarchy, and they were focused on luxury products and also on weaponry. For example, here we have dyeing, how do you call this? Dyeing tintes, vaya. Or a tapestry, like la Real Fábrica de Tapices en Madrid, or glass, like la Real Fábrica de Cristales de la Granja, or artillery, like this in Cantabria. But the most important development of the 18th century is the development of the international trade, also called colonial trade. The early modern age is the time of history, or the period of history, in which the European nations built these enormous colonial empires, and there was an intense trade between the colonies and the mainland. They usually exchanged manufactured goods from the mainland, and in exchange of raw materials that they could only be produced, that could only be produced in the colonies, such as timber, fish, tobacco, sugar, gold and silver, silk, cotton, pepper, spices, etc. etc. The most important route of this colonial trade was the triangular trade, which is a route that starts in Europe, and they brought manufactured goods to Africa. There they were exchanged with enslaved Africans, black slaves, who later were sold mostly in the Caribbean islands and the 13 colonies, the British 13 colonies, and they worked in the plantations. And from there, they imported raw materials back to Europe. And this is how this kind of trade, of black slaves trade, was very profitable and made these merchants very rich. Here you can see a lot of them, well, this is how they were transported. These are some advertisements of Negro sales or some inspections. And what were the consequences of this 18th century economic and demographic growth? Well, the main one is that the bourgeoisie, who were the ones who invested in this kind of business, mostly trade, are going to become very, very wealthy. They're going to earn a lot of money, and they are going to be the main protagonists of the upcoming revolutions. And also, the production of goods, trade and capital became more important instead of the rents of the land. So this is going to cause a crisis in the Ancien regime. Here you have a summary of this first point. If you want, you can pause the video and take a look, or you can check this out in the virtual classroom. But we are going to continue with the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment, or la Ilustración, was an intellectual movement in the 18th century which proposed a new idea of organizing society. They had a lot of new ideas, but we can summarize them in three main proposals, which the first one being reason or logical thought, being the only way to understand the world and to achieve the truth, an optimistic view of nature and the belief that humans were born to be happy, and also the idea of progress, that the human will could transform society, so we can leave a better world to our sons than the one we inherited from our parents. And this was all of this set of ideas was or were developed by a lot of authors, mainly in France. But here we have God himself, Immanuel Kant. Oh, Dios mío, es que este tío es una máquina. Which, well, there are a lot of texts now. You can pause the video if you want to read them. I'm not going to do that because if I did so, this video is going to last a lot. But here you can read a lot of these ideas. For example, this is how Immanuel Kant justifies that the idea of enlightenment is the use of reason or your own understanding. Here Nicolas de Condorcet says some ideas about this idea of progress, or explains some of these ideas. El Barón de Holbach criticizes the Christian religion because most of these ideas, mostly about reason, they were opposed to the Christian religion. But well, there are several authors, but the main ones are the three big French authors, Montesquieu, Voltaire and Rousseau, particularly the first and the third, because they were political philosophers. What did they say? Montesquieu is the one who comes with the idea of the separation of powers, and here it explains it. There are three powers: executive, legislative and judicial, and they have to be exercised by different individuals. If not, it's a tyranny. Then Rousseau, in the social contract, he develops the idea of the national sovereignty, which means that government is a kind of a contract, a social contract between the rulers and the governed, and if the rulers are taking bad decisions, the governed have the right to rebel. Why? Because they have the ultimate power, they have the sovereignty. Every law that the people has not ratified in person is null and void. These two ideas, separation of powers and national sovereignty, are going to be the key ideas of the upcoming revolutions, mostly the American and the French ones. Then we have Voltaire, who is criticizing the state's society, and how all of these ideas spread throughout Europe. Well, mainly in three ways. First, these private library salons. These were meetings of the nobility or the wealthier classes in which they usually read or discuss about these new Enlightenment ideas. Second one are the new media. This time, the 18th century, there were a lot of new publications such as magazines, newspapers, or pamphlets in which these ideas were written. And finally, the main work of Denis Diderot and Jean d'Alembert, which is the Encyclopedia, l'Encyclopédie. This is a vast 28-volume work which was published in the second half of the 18th century and in which all the knowledge of the time was summarized, as you can see here. Then we have enlightened despotism, which means that there were some of these monarchs in the second half of the 18th century which wanted to implement some of these enlightened ideas, mostly the ones related with progress, not the ones related with the critic to the absolute monarchy, of course. So they wanted to introduce these ideas about progress, but without having to give up their absolute authority. That is why they are called despots, because they are still absolute monarchs, but they are enlightened. Despotismo ilustrado. Some of them were Maria Theresa I of Austria, Catherine II of Russia, Carlos III de España. You just need to know one of them, for ejemplo, Carlos III. Or Frederick II of Prussia, Joseph II of Habsburg. And this enlightened despotism can be summarized with the phrase, with the sentence, all for the people, nothing by the people. Todo para el pueblo menos, todo para el pueblo pero sin el pueblo. What kind of these enlightened ideas can we say? For example, rationalism of administration, education reforms, development of agriculture, industry, freedom of trade, whatever. So again, here you have the summary, and let's go to the 18th century in Spain. First, the century is going to open up with the establishment of a new dynasty in the Spanish crown, the French dynasty of the Bourbons. Why? Because the last king of the Habsburg dynasty, Carlos II, died in the year 1700 with no heirs, with no sons. So in his last will, he's going to designate Philip of Anjou, which was a French prince, actually the grandson of Louis XIV, as the king of Spain. And he's going to become the new Felipe V. But there was this fear in the European monarchies that France and Spain could join together as a single monarchy. So Carlos de Austria, Charles of Austria, is going to contest this the throne. Is going to claim also the Spanish throne. So, and Austria is going to be supported by most of the European countries that were scared of the combined military power of Spain and France. So there's going to be a war, the War of the Spanish Succession. Here you can see that Felipe V was the... I'm not sure how to say this in English, but is the grandson of the sister of Carlos II, and Carlos de Austria is the son of the his brother-in-law, o sea, es el hijo de su cuñado. And the war breaks out, the War of the Spanish Succession, starting in the year 1701 and ending in 1714, even though in Spain the last resistance was defeated in 1715, 1 year later. So, as I said, Felipe V was supported by both the Corona de Castilla and France, while Carlos de Austria was supported by most of the rest of the European great powers. And this war was both, as you can see in this map, an international war, a European war, but also a Spanish civil war, because most of the people from the Corona de Castilla supported Felipe V, while most of the Aragonese people, like los aragoneses, they supported Carlos de Austria. So, military speaking, there were in Spain, the troops of Felipe V finally got victorious, while in Europe, Luis XIV had to sign the peace. The main episodes of this war was the conquest of Gibraltar by the British military, the Bourbon victory in Almansa, provincia de Albacete, and the final assault on Barcelona on September 11, 1714. So the war ended with the treaties of Utrecht and Rastatt, both are two cities here in the Low Countries, and by these treaties all the European countries, the European great powers, recognized Felipe V as the King of Spain in exchange of the loss of all the Spanish European territories. The Spanish Low Countries went to Austria, Milan went to Austria, Nápoles and Sicilia went to Austria, and Cerdeña was given to the Kingdom of Savoy, el Reino Saboya, que está por aquí. And also, Gibraltar and Menorca became British territory. Later we will recover Menorca, but Gibraltar still remain British until today. And finally, the Bourbon reforms. You have a whole page in your notes, but we already said in class that you only have to study the second point of the political reforms, which is this. Los decretos, parezco un chino. Los decretos de nueva planta. This was part of the policy of administrative centralization of Felipe V. With these decrees, there were one decree for each one of the Aragonese kingdoms, for Aragon, for Valencia, for Catalonia, and for Mallorca, and with this they destroyed all the common laws and institutions of the Aragonese crown, and they were replaced by the Castilian law. This was a revenge for supporting the Austrian pretender during the war. And well, there are some other reforms. They were improvements in agriculture, in industry, in agriculture, for example, new settlements, in internal trade, in foreign trade, but by all of these kings, which were the first Bourbon kings, Felipe V, Luis I, luego Felipe V one more time, luego Fernando VI, finally Carlos III, which is the most important example of enlightened despot in Spain. And that's it. Remember, in the political reforms, only los decretos de nueva planta are important. The rest, fin, the end, with the Spanish troops fighting in the war. Bueno amigos, pues esto es todo. Espero que os haya quedado claro y ya sabéis que si tenéis algún tipo de duda podéis escribirme o bien en los comentarios o bien por los canales habituales, ¿no? Ya sabéis, todas mis redes, etcétera, etcétera. No olviden suscribirse y darle a like, que no vale para nada, pero pues a uno le hace ilusión y nos vemos en el próximo. Adiós.